Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the fourth album from Biosphere, Cirque. So, how do you follow up an album like Substrata? This incredible, almost instant classic in ambient music that many consider to be the pinnacle of the entire genre? Well, spoilers, Cirque is quite similar to the previous album and also not quite as impactful. You might be able to predict that, given how it's not talked about nearly as much, though that's also true of a lot of Biosphere albums not being talked about enough. While it's true that Cirque has a lot of the same ingredients as Substrata, and even a couple in common with his first two, you can say that there's not as much novelty in this one. But the particular execution is quite different from Substrata. It all creates a vibe that you don't get out of that album, one that's kinda hard to describe. I suppose if anything, Substrata felt like it had a bit more of a human touch than this one, which, again, unsurprisingly makes it the stronger album. This one I don't really feel as strong an emotional presence in, but that's not to say it's the kind of album where I just don't feel anything. I mean, this album feels like we're in the middle of this land survey or documentary and just looking over this vast icy landscape, but there's no humans anywhere. The sense of environment created by this album is absolutely as spot on as that last album and can feel like it's really taking you somewhere else, some distant reach of the mountains. But there's also a sense of familiarity to it as well, like it doesn't make you feel quite as alone. Not because there's more human presence, or even because it's more peaceful. It's more kind of isolated in the sense that it's like relieving to get away from people. Feels more spacey and detached, but in a good way, in an oddly comforting way, I guess. I don't know how to put it, but I may as well discuss individual tracks. Like Substrata, this is very much an album that works best listened to in one unbroken piece, maybe even more so than that album. But the 11 tracks here do all have pretty distinct identities. The opener, Nook Cranny, is a pretty low-key beginning with its shifty synth pads, some that chime out like distant bells, all while this big muffled kick drum runs through everything like a heartbeat. Boom, 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 boom. And there's some pads of effects that sounds like a sea of crickets in the background. It's all very comfortable sounding. And it moves into Le Grand Dôme. I don't know how you say that in French, but whatever. That has a very similar overall vibe, but different ingredients. The filtered percussion gives this one a tad more energy, though it still has that icy and mysterious pad in the background, occasionally having this high-pitched flute-like quality to it in little parts. And there's some sample of someone rambling in, I think, French. Like, tracks like these are relatively simple, but they do once again set up that sense of environment. There are occasionally tracks here that are just like really short interludes that just barely justify being there at all. The 51-second Grande Flora usually passed by without me noticing. It's like an outro to the previous track that basically sounds like some muffled and looped violin-ish sounds. Though again, it doesn't sound exactly like the previous track. Once I actually paid attention to it, I was like, oh, there it is. I can probably notice that now on subsequent listens. I mean, it's still not that interesting, but I don't think I necessarily want it removed. But it's after this point where the album really starts to kick into gear for me. Black Lamb Grey Falcon is made up of a strange synth stab echoing over into reverb over a bassy pad, and what sounds like vinyl crackling, or maybe a lo-fi recording of a campfire, while various samples come and go on top of it, like a warm but distant guitar chord, some honking horn sections filtered to sound really far away, and some really low-key orchestral soundtrack piece with clarinets and other woodwinds that keeps getting layered on top of itself, and giving the whole track a longing and yearning feeling. Though switching over to some more menacing sounding orchestral samples as well that sound taken from the creepiest parts of a 50s Disney movie. It all comes together in a really interesting and evocative way and transitions seamlessly into the next interlude, Miniature Rock Dwellers, which is little more than some strange synth rumbling and some distant tapping noise. It does give a tiny bit of an intriguing vibe, but doesn't often grab my attention. We move into When I Leave, which seems like a little bit of a throwback to the days of his first two albums with its steady techno percussion textures, though still very toned down, just a kick and a hi-hat. with various repetitive loops of synth textures creating a very subtle and stripped back vibe behind them. All the while there's that voice ample repeatedly saying, "When I leave, don't follow." Also that whole part at the beginning which sounds like a woman talking about Roman gods or something. I will admit this track isn't usually a major highlight for me. I think there are other tracks that are more interesting and evocative, but this is one of the most memorable moments on here all the same. When it comes to this album, I think I prefer tracks on here like the next one, Iberia Eterea. While there are textures here that sound all cold and mechanical, there's also a repetitive sample of some clarinet and trumpet that gives this track a sense of warmth, and halfway through there's even some percussion introduced that has some kind of fast-paced jazzy feel to it. You can see tracks like these hinting at directions he'd focus on in later albums of his like Shenzhou and Drop Sound, which I think is pretty cool. This is one of the more emotionally charged tracks on this album, and probably my most consistent favorite in the bunch. Then we get another interlude, Moistened and Dried, probably my favorite of the interludes thanks to all its synth effects that sound like little droplets of water in a cave. One of the most distinctive sounding tracks in the bunch. Then we have a two-parter track called Algae and Fungi. While the two parts of this track aren't much more connected than any other pair of adjacent tracks on the album, you can easily tell when one part ends and the next begins. Though they do definitely have a fair few synth textures in common, so they justify having the same title. Both parts of Algae and Fungi are among my favorites in the album, like they're also the ones with probably the fastest tempos. Part 1 starts out subtle with its occasional synth stabs, though forming more of a rhythmic groove with its various synth pads as it goes on and involving this skittering, nervous beat forming underneath it later on. And part 2 keeps some of the synth pads in the brightest stab sound but has all these rumbling sounds on top of it, and later another jazzy but subtle break beat coming in underneath that gives it a similar nervous energy. And finally the album ends with Too Fragile to Walk On, which takes us out on a more comfortable and relaxed note, with various shifting synth pads that echo out into the distance and feel like sitting by yourself in the calm air under the moonlight. Very nice way to go out. Oh and yeah, I also got to talk about the bonus tracks. This album got a 2016 reissue with 6 more tracks tacked on at the end. Less than the others, but you know. There's somewhat interesting alternate versions of When I Leave and Algae and Fungi that don't as neatly fit into the atmosphere of the main album, but are still cool. Provide warmer and more agreeable tones to those tracks than the originals did, and the 4 remaining tracks are all longer than any of the other tracks from the main album. They all seem somewhere in the same ballpark and are cool in all their own ways, but I can see why none of them fit quite as well into the main album. Most of them mostly just feel like they ran on a bit too long for their own good. Like, the best of them was almost definitely Minuarta, a slowly evolving ambient techno piece that's quite minimalistic, but has several different interesting sections and makes good use of its 8-minute length. The percussion does feel a bit heavy to work as seamlessly into the main album, but it is very enjoyable all the same. Hoodoo is also quite long, almost 9 minutes. Not as much evolution there, unfortunately, but it does have this very airy and spaced out vibe that's pretty cool, I guess. That one main synth pad sounds a little like a gas leak, but, you know, it's still cool. Slowly Etching has a similar empty and expansive vibe to it that's also a little spooky on top of that and fills more and more space as it goes on. And B9 sounds like another part of Algae and Fungi, I guess. A bit more rhythmic with its bright synth stab that's more on beats. There's an organ lick later on, but it's alright. There is cool stuff to be found in these bonus tracks, but like the ones from the Microgravity reissue, I don't think they add much that's absolutely essential listening. Minuarta and Slowly Etching are the best too. So yeah, that's Cirque. Overall, while I'll admit this album isn't infinitely replayable, there are elements that you'd go on to improve upon in later albums. It may feel like a mix of several different Biosphere albums in retrospect. I do think there is a definite experience to be gleaned from here that you can't get elsewhere. Its minimalistic style of ambience does work wonders, and while some moments are better than others, it all fits together really seamlessly, and lesser parts can be held up by how they fit in the context of the continuous mix. And the most important thing about any ambient album is whether it can take you somewhere else and put you in a different space. And Cirque most definitely succeeds on that front. I'm not sure yet where I'd personally rank it, but it is a very solid album, and another example of Geir Jansen's talents for putting together an immersive musical environment. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. If there are some people you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.